You've been lied to about loneliness. They told you it makes you weak, broken, easier to ignore. But what if the opposite is true? What if the more alone you become, the more dangerous you actually are? Not in the loud, chaotic way people expect, not in violence, not in rage, but in something far more unsettling: clarity. Because the moment you start losing people, something else begins to disappear with them. The noise. At first, it feels like loss. Messages stop coming. Invitations fade. Conversations shrink into silence. And for a while, you try to fight it. You reach out. You explain yourself. You try to stay connected to a world that's already moving on without you. But then, something shifts. You stop chasing. And when that happens, something most people never experience begins to unfold. You start seeing things as they really are, not how they're presented, not how they're socially accepted, but how they actually function beneath the surface. You notice how people only show up when they need something. You notice how loyalty is often just convenience in disguise. You notice how quickly respect disappears the moment you stop being useful. And that's when the first transformation begins. You stop expecting. And when you stop expecting, you stop being controlled. Most people are predictable because they are emotionally dependent. They need validation, attention, approval. And because of that, they can be influenced, manipulated, even owned, without realizing it. But loneliness removes that leverage. When no one's approval feeds you anymore, no one can starve you either. That's when you become unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous, because now your decisions are no longer based on fear of losing people. They're based on something colder, something more precise: self-interest. You start walking away without explaining. You start saying no without guilt. You start observing instead of reacting. And people notice, not consciously at first, but they feel it. There's something different about you. You're harder to read, harder to influence, harder to control. And that makes them uncomfortable, because human beings rely on patterns. Predictability creates safety, but when someone no longer follows those patterns, they become a threat. Not because they're aggressive, but because they're free. And freedom, in a world built on silent social contracts, is deeply unsettling. But here's where it gets darker, because loneliness doesn't just change how you see others. It changes how you see yourself. Without constant interaction, without feedback, without distraction, you're left alone with your own thoughts. And most people avoid this at all costs, because in that silence, there's nowhere to hide. You start confronting things you've ignored for years: your weaknesses, your fears, your insecurities. At first, it's uncomfortable, even painful. But if you stay there long enough, something rare begins to happen. You adapt. You learn to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. You learn to analyze your own emotions instead of being controlled by them. You become mentally self-sufficient. And that's when the second transformation begins. You stop needing emotional support, not because you're numb, but because you've trained yourself to process everything internally. Pain doesn't break you the same way anymore. Rejection doesn't shake you. Silence doesn't scare you. And when nothing external can easily destabilize you, you become extremely difficult to manipulate. This is where most people misunderstand the lonely individual. They assume isolation creates fragility. But in reality, it often creates independence. And independence is power. Because now you're operating on a different system than everyone else. While others are negotiating relationships, seeking approval, and maintaining appearances, you're calculating, observing, choosing. And that's when people start reacting to you differently. Some will try to pull you back in. Some will test you. Some will even resent you, without knowing why. Because on some level, they recognize something unsettling. You don't need them. And a person who doesn't need anything is a person who cannot be controlled. But here's the part no one talks about. There's a line, a point where loneliness stops being a tool and starts becoming something else entirely. Something colder, something more dangerous. Because when you spend too much time disconnected from others, you don't just lose dependence, you risk losing something far more important. And once that happens, you don't just become unpredictable, you become untouchable. There's a point where loneliness stops sharpening you and starts hollowing you out. And most people don't even realize when they've crossed that line. At first, your distance feels like control. You choose silence over meaningless conversation. You choose solitude over shallow connections. It feels intentional, strategic, but slowly, something begins to fade. Not your intelligence, not your awareness, something deeper, your emotional sensitivity. You stop reacting to things that used to matter. A message left unanswered, irrelevant, someone walking away, expected, disrespect, not even worth acknowledging. On the surface, this looks like strength, but underneath, something dangerous is forming. Because when you no longer feel the need to respond, you also stop feeling the need to connect. And without connection, empathy begins to erode. Not all at once, quietly. You start seeing people less as individuals and more as patterns. Predictable behaviors, repeatable mistakes, you analyze instead of relate. Observe instead of engage. And while that makes you incredibly sharp, it also makes you distant in a way most people can't understand. Because now, you're not just outside the system, you're above it. Or at least, it feels that way. You watch people chase validation, argue over trivial things, cling to relationships that drain them, and you can't unsee it anymore. It all looks obvious, transparent, almost mechanical. And that's when the third transformation begins. Detachment. Not the peaceful kind people talk about in philosophy. Something colder. You stop trying to fix people. You stop explaining yourself. You stop investing energy where there's no return. And eventually, you stop caring. This is where you become truly dangerous. Because a person who no longer seeks connection also no longer fears losing it. And when there's nothing left to lose, there's nothing left to control. Think about it. Most people stay in line because of what they might lose: reputation, relationships, approval, belonging. But if those things no longer hold value to you, what exactly is stopping you? That's what people sense, even if they can't explain it. There's an absence in you, a silence where emotional dependency used to be. And that silence is intimidating, because now your actions are no longer guided by social expectations. They're guided by logic, efficiency, outcome. You don't argue to be understood. You speak when it's necessary. You don't react emotionally. You respond strategically. And that makes every move you make harder to predict, harder to counter, harder to influence. But here's the paradox. The same loneliness that made you strong is also what can make you lose perspective. Because when you spend too much time analyzing people from the outside, you forget what it feels like to be one of them. You begin to underestimate emotion, to dismiss connection as weakness, to see vulnerability as inefficiency. And that's where the danger turns inward. Because complete detachment doesn't just isolate you from others. It isolates you from reality. Human nature isn't purely logical. It's messy, irrational, emotional. And if you ignore that completely, you don't become superior. You become disconnected. And disconnected people make miscalculations. They overlook loyalty. They underestimate unpredictability in others. They forget that emotion is often the very thing that drives the world. So while you've mastered independence, you risk losing balance. And without balance, even the most self-controlled mind can collapse under its own isolation. That's the final truth most people never understand. Loneliness is power, but only in moderation. Because if you go too far, you don't just become dangerous to others, you become dangerous to yourself. And the most powerful individuals aren't the ones who reject connection completely. They're the ones who can walk alone without forgetting how to return.